My name is Marianne. I'm 37. And last Sunday, I stood in my parents' dining room while my sister Olivia said I was ruining the family vibe just by existing. I'd brought a homemade pie like I always did, but Mom looked at me and said, "Why didn't you just stay at your little shop? This isn't the place for leftovers." I didn't cry. I just nodded. Right. I'll stay where I'm wanted. And I left without saying goodbye. Before I share what happened next, let me know where you're watching from. Tap, like if you've ever felt like the outsider in your own family, and stay tuned if you're ready to hear a quiet kind of revenge. I drove home in silence. The road from my parents' house back to Roseberry was familiar, but tonight it felt longer, colder, like the trees on either side had grown taller just to close in on me. When I pulled up in front of my shop, second verse, I turned off the engine and just sat there for a moment. The front window was softly lit. Inside, shelves lined with antique teacups, embroidered linens, and odd trinkets whispered of other people's stories someone once loved enough to keep. I stepped inside, flipped on the warmer lights, and walked toward the Singer sewing machine near the back counter. It was from the 1920s. Still ran like a dream. I reached out and placed my palm on its cool metal arm. That machine had outlasted marriages, wars, fashion trends, and now, my family's patience. I started unpacking the pie. Funny how you can pour your heart into something as simple as a dessert, only for it to be dismissed like day-old bread. I sliced a piece, sat by the window and ate it alone, watching the town slowly quiet for the night. You know what they never tell you? That the ache of being unwanted by your own family doesn't show up all at once. It leaks in like a draft through old windows. You feel it in the smallest moments. The way your mother introduces your sister's new promotion but forgets to ask how your business is doing. The way your father chuckles politely but never looks you in the eye. The way your own name becomes an afterthought at the dinner table. Growing up in Roseberry, Olivia was the golden girl. She was bright, ambitious, polished. She played piano, ran track, graduated early, landed a finance job in Portland, and wore her confidence like designer perfume. Our parents adored her. My mom, Diana, used to beam when introducing her at church socials. "This is Olivia, our banker, so driven, so dependable." And then she'd glance at me. "And this is Marianne. She works with antiques." They never outright said it, but the message was clear. Olivia was the investment. I was the hobby. When I opened second verse 7 years ago, it wasn't just about restoring old things. It was about proving that something forgotten could still matter. That beauty didn't expire. That even cracked porcelain had value. I'd put every penny I had into the shop, painted the walls myself, refinished the hardwood floors, rescued every display case from junkyards and flea markets. And somehow, despite the slow months and skeptical looks from passing tourists, it worked. I found a rhythm, a peace. But peace doesn't protect you from the way your mother wrinkles her nose when you mention restoring a church pew, or the way Olivia says, "Still doing the artsy thing?" Like it's a phase I should have outgrown. I took another bite of pie, then covered the rest and slid it into the old glass fridge by the register. Tomorrow I'd donate it to the women's shelter. Someone would appreciate it there. The clock ticked slowly toward midnight. I didn't cry. I hadn't cried for them in years, but I did feel something, like a wire had finally snapped inside me. Not the kind that sends sparks flying, the kind that simply lets go. They didn't want me at their table. So maybe it was time I built a different kind of table, one where I didn't need permission to belong, one where silence wasn't punishment, but power. And as I turned off the lights and locked the door behind me, I realized something important. You don't always have to shout to make your presence known. Sometimes the quietest step away is the loudest thing you'll ever do. The next morning, I opened the shop early, like I always did on Sundays. Roseberry moved slow on the weekends. People lingered longer over their coffee, strolled the sidewalks with dogs that were better dressed than most teenagers, and peeked into the town's quieter corners, like mine. Second verse sat near the end of a street that led nowhere important. Most people stumbled upon it accidentally. They came in thinking they'd kill a few minutes and left with a vintage brooch or a story they didn't expect to hear. I liked it that way. I liked the quiet, the control. Out there in the world of family gatherings and birthday brunches, I was too much or too little, too different. In here, everything had a place, even me. I dusted the shelves, rearranged the hand-painted dishes from the 1940s, ran my fingers along the spines of books so old their pages smelled like pipe smoke and secrets. The shop was my sanctuary, and on days like today, it was also my shield. A little after 10, the bell over the door chimed. It was Mr. Fletcher, an old history teacher who used to buy first-edition novels for his grandkids. He looked around, adjusted his hat, then smiled. "Still smells like cedar and wisdom in here," he said. I smiled back. "Trying to bottle both. Let me know if you ever figure out how." He didn't stay long, just long enough to buy a brass bookmark and tell me his granddaughter made Dean's List. I congratulated him like it didn't sting, like my mother hadn't told everyone at last year's Thanksgiving dinner that Olivia's daughter Abby was destined for Juilliard, while pretending I didn't even have plants to brag about. After he left, I found myself staring at an old wooden chest I'd recently purchased from a widow clearing out her barn. It sat in the back room, still dusty, still locked. Something about it called to me. I pulled on gloves, grabbed a soft brush, and slowly began to clean it. The wood was thick, hand-carved, not fancy but intentional. Someone had made this with care. I found myself whispering to it like I always did to pieces that felt alive. Sometimes I believed they whispered back. An hour passed before I discovered the tiny latch under one corner. It clicked open with a sound so satisfying it felt like permission. Inside was a painting wrapped in linen. I unfolded it slowly. A woman in profile, seated by a window. Oil on canvas, maybe late 1800s. The color was muted but powerful, ochres and ash blues. And there was a quiet sorrow in the way her hands were folded. No signature, no title, just her. I don't know why, but I stared at her for a long time. Something about the way she sat alone, looking out, felt familiar. Like she'd been left out of something too. Forgotten. Or worse, never noticed at all. I set the painting gently on the counter, took a deep breath, and thought, maybe I wasn't meant to fit into the frame they built for me. Maybe I was meant to restore the ones that were left behind. The rest of the day passed in a hush. A few more customers wandered in. A couple bought an old phonograph and promised to give it a second life. I watched them walk away with it like they were carrying something sacred. By the time the sun began to dip behind the hills, casting long orange shadows across the storefront, I felt it again. That wire inside me, not snapping this time, but tightening into something stronger. Not bitterness, not pride, resolve. That night, I sat by the Singer machine again, but instead of working on repairs, I opened my laptop. I started researching antique oil paintings. I opened 3 tabs, typed in artist registries, and clicked on a few auction house databases I hadn't used in years. The woman in the window deserved to be seen. And maybe, so did I. That night, sleep didn't come easy. The image of the woman in the painting stayed with me. There was something in the angle of her shoulders, in the way her eyes drifted toward the light but never quite reached it. It felt personal, like she knew something I was just beginning to understand. I made chamomile tea and sat at the kitchen table with my laptop, the painting propped gently against the wall nearby. The linen had been washed and pressed. Her face looked clearer now in the warm light of my apartment above the shop. I started researching. At first I typed vague things like 19th century oil portrait unsigned and woman by window painting, which, as you can imagine, yielded about 1 million results and no answers. But I kept going. Something in me needed to. Around 2 a.m, I found a lead. A small online archive of women artists in New England during the 1800s had a section labeled Anonymous Works Recovered from Estate Sales. One thumbnail image caught my eye. It was another portrait, same muted palette, same melancholy grace. The artist listed? Unknown. But the style, brushwork, even the subtle way the light was rendered, it was nearly identical. I leaned forward, breath held. The archive listed a name linked to multiple unsigned works. A.M. Bellamy, a woman who'd reportedly painted in Massachusetts during the 1870s. Little was known about her. Most of her work had been scattered, sold off by distant relatives who hadn't realized or cared what they had. I whispered the name. A.M. Bellamy. There was no photograph of her, no biography, just a handful of traced sales and some journal notes from a collector who believed she'd been erased because of the era she lived in. A woman painting alone, quietly, without a gallery or a patron? Most never made it past the parlor walls. Something about that filled me with a fire I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't an art historian. I wasn't anyone's expert. But I knew how to look closely. I'd spent my life examining the overlooked. My fingers knew the grain of aged wood better than my own skin. I could tell you if a carving was done in haste or love. And this painting? It hadn't just been made, it had been mourned. I reached out to a contact I knew from years ago, a private collector named Lyle who specialized in American folk art and obscure female painters. He'd bought a vintage quilt from me once and told me to call if I ever found something that didn't belong in a thrift store. I sent him a photo of the painting. Didn't say much. Just, "Does she look familiar to you?" He responded at 5:47 a.m. "Where the hell did you find this?" I laughed quietly into my mug. Maybe that's when I realized the shift. Not just that the painting was valuable, but that I had been right to see her, to notice her, to believe she meant something. It was the first time in a long time that I felt certain, not about what would happen, but about who I was when no one was watching. Later that morning, I opened the shop late. I needed a few more hours to think. I lit a candle on the counter, turned on a record, and sat with the painting while the soft hum of Billie Holiday drifted through the room. There's something sacred about finding what others forget, a quiet kind of justice. I didn't know it yet, but that portrait would change everything, not just because of its worth, but because it reminded me some stories are too important to stay buried, even the silent ones. Over the next few days, I became someone else, someone I hadn't seen in a while. I wasn't just the woman who ran a quiet antique shop in a forgotten corner of Oregon. I was the woman who stayed up until 2 a.m. reading auction records, tracing brushstrokes on high-resolution scans, cross-referencing color palettes with 19th century pigments and varnishes. I was the woman who poured black coffee over pages of handwritten notes, whose heart raced every time she uncovered another thread in a story no one had cared enough to finish. The more I learned about A.M. Bellamy, the more haunted I became by the way she'd been ignored. Her works had no provenance, no title cards in museums, no gallery retrospectives. She'd lived and died in the margins, but her art still spoke, quietly, fiercely. One night, I stood in front of the painting and whispered, "They didn't see you, but I do." And I meant it. It was Lyle who finally confirmed it. After showing the photo to a few colleagues, he called and said he believed this portrait was an original Bellamy. There were no doubts in his voice. He even offered to broker a private sale if I was willing to part with it. "I think it could go for over 60 grand, he said casually, like he hadn't just dropped a lightning bolt in the middle of my living room. I stared at the phone in silence, letting the number echo in my head. $60,000. It wasn't about the money. Not really. It was about what it meant. That I had seen something no one else did. That I had recognized value where others saw dust. That I had been right to believe in something, and in myself, when the people closest to me couldn't even pretend to try. I agreed to the sale. And when the wire transfer came through, I sat in the back room of Second Verse with my bank account glowing on the screen and tears slowly falling onto my lap. I didn't cry because I was rich. I cried because for the first time in a long, long time, I felt validated. Not by a mother who said I should have gone into nursing, not by a sister who laughed when I told her restoring old things brought me peace, but by the universe itself, by history, by a stranger with paint on her fingers and loneliness in her eyes who had lived a century before me. That night, I opened a document on my laptop and typed the words, Quiet Grove Ventures. I didn't know exactly what I was going to build yet. I just knew it had to be mine. Quiet, intentional, steady. It would be a place where forgotten stories were preserved, where beauty didn't need to be loud to matter, a small rebellion dressed as a business. I didn't tell anyone. No announcement on social media, no calls to the family. I just moved in silence, like Bellamy did. Because sometimes the most powerful thing a woman can do is stop asking for permission and start claiming space. By the end of the week, I had filed the LLC paperwork, opened a new account, and started scouting listings for old properties. I wasn't rushing. I was listening, letting the next step arrive on its own time. Every evening I lit a candle next to the empty spot where the painting once hung. She was gone now. But what she left behind was still growing. And so was I. There's something almost sacred about moving in silence, not to hide, but to protect. After the sale of the painting, I didn't go out and buy anything flashy. No new car, no renovations, no vacations to prove a point. I kept showing up at Second Verse like nothing had changed. The same tea kettle in the back room, the same cracked stool behind the counter. the same dusty light through the front window that hit the shelves just right at 3 p.m. But inside me, something had shifted. I started studying old properties listed in Rosebery and the surrounding counties. I wasn't looking for anything perfect, just something forgotten, neglected, full of bones and dust and maybe a little bit of magic. I wanted to create a space that could hold beauty without needing to shout about it. A quiet grove, just like the name suggested. One afternoon, while sipping coffee in the back of the shop, I found it. A listing buried deep on a local real estate site. A building from 1904 that had once been a general store, then a mechanic's garage, then left vacant for the past 12 years. The photo showed flaking white paint, boarded windows, a rusted tin roof. Most people would scroll right past. I stared at it for 20 full minutes. It was perfect. By the end of the week, I had a tour scheduled. The agent kept apologizing for the condition. I kept smiling. The place was a wreck, sure, but it spoke to me, the same way that painting had, like it had been waiting for someone to see it again. A month later, I closed on the property under the name Quiet Grove Ventures. No one in my family knew. At Sunday dinner, well, not that I was invited anymore, but in that world I was still the odd one out with dusty shelves and a cute little hobby. Let them think that. In the silence, I began building something real. I hired local carpenters who understood the rhythm of old buildings. Men who didn't flinch at uneven floors or bowed ceilings. We peeled back layers of linoleum and drywall, revealing the original woodwork underneath. Every nail I pulled out felt like undoing a lie someone once told me about what was and wasn't worth saving. There was an old upstairs apartment that had been used as storage. I converted it into a workspace. High ceilings, slanted windows, soft, natural light. I filled it with swatches of fabric, books on restoration techniques, sketches of how the gallery might look when it was ready. I still opened the shop every day, still fixed chipped porcelain and rewired antique lamps. But at night, I worked on the other life. The one no one knew about yet. The one no one could take from me. It wasn't just about creating a business. It was about reclaiming something I didn't have words for yet. A sense of place, of legacy, of building something solid without needing anyone's approval or applause. I wrote a mission statement one night, long after midnight, when the house was quiet and the air was still. To restore what others discard. To protect what history forgot. To offer a second verse to the stories that matter. I printed it out, folded it neatly, and tucked it into a drawer. It wasn't for anyone else. Not yet. It was for me. Proof that something was taking root, and this time, no one would get to tear it down. I used to think being seen meant being praised. That if I worked hard enough, stayed kind enough, gave just the right amount of myself away, someone, anyone, would finally say, "You matter." That maybe one day at Thanksgiving my mom would pat my hand and say, "We're proud of you, Marianne." But pride, I learned, doesn't always sound like applause. Sometimes it's the echo of your own footsteps in a quiet room you built with your own hands. The gallery was coming together, little by little. We had finished restoring the beams in the front display room. The plaster walls had been sanded smooth. Light streamed through the tall, arched windows now, casting patterns across the floor like stained glass. It still smelled faintly of sawdust and linseed oil, but it was starting to feel like something alive. I began collecting again, not just to sell, but to keep. Folk art, hand-carved figurines, woven baskets from the early 1900s, ceramics with imperfect glazes. I found a quilt stitched by a woman in 1892, with initials embroidered so delicately in the corner that it took me an hour to find them. I ran my fingers across the seams and thought about her hands, her breath, her quiet diligence. She mattered, even if no one ever told her. One afternoon I drove out to a rural estate sale. A farmer's widow had passed and everything was being sold. I walked through her home slowly, touching only with my eyes at first. A piano with chipped keys, lace curtains, a desk filled with old letters tied together with fraying ribbon. You could feel the weight of memory in every corner. I bought 3 things: a cracked sugar bowl, a hand-painted wooden tray, and a child's chair with initials burned into the bottom. On the way home, I didn't turn on the radio. I let the silence ride with me. It no longer felt empty. Back at the gallery, I placed the items on a temporary shelf marked "Quiet Finds." It wasn't about their market value. Most people wouldn't pay much for them. But that wasn't the point anymore. There was a kind of wealth in being able to recognize soul in forgotten things, and maybe, just maybe, in forgotten people. One evening, as I was locking up, I saw a group of tourists peering through the front windows, a couple in their 60s wearing matching Oregon Ducks sweatshirts. The woman pressed her hand to the glass and smiled. "This place," she said to her husband. "It feels like it remembers." She didn't know I could hear her. She didn't need to. In that moment, something settled in me. I didn't need my mother's blessing. I didn't need Olivia's admiration. What I needed was here, right here in the bones of this space. In the way the floor creaked when you walked across it, in the way strangers paused and felt something before they even stepped inside. Recognition didn't have to be loud. It could be soft. It could be silent. It could arrive slowly, like light filling a room you didn't realize had been dark. And as I stood there with the key in my hand and my heart steady in my chest, I knew this for certain. I hadn't just found value in that old painting. I'd found it in myself. It's funny how some of the biggest things in life happen without witnesses. There were no champagne toasts or ribbon-cutting ceremonies when Quiet Grove Ventures took its first breath. No social media post announcing big things coming. Just me, a clipboard, and a stack of renovation permits tucked into a canvas bag that smelled like lemon oil and old paper. The outside of the gallery still looked like nothing special. Paint peeled around the windows, the sign was just a temporary plank with my handwriting in chalk, and the sidewalk out front was cracked from decades of frost. But inside, something was taking shape. I started small. One section of the space became a rotating exhibit of folk art, not the kind that makes headlines or stuns auction houses, the kind that lived in family basements, attic trunks, and estate sale corners. Carved birds, woven baskets, weathered wooden toys. Each piece had a story, and I made sure it was told. I wrote them by hand on tags, placed beside the items on natural linen mats. People began to come. At first, it was just passers-by curious about the soft glow behind the dusty front window. Then it was neighbors. Then a small local blog wrote a piece about the gallery that feels like a memory. They called it a place where time slows down and old things breathe again. I didn't talk much about it to my family. Not that they asked. At one point, Olivia stopped by Second Verse on her way back from a yoga retreat. She walked around the store like a real estate agent appraising a fixer-upper. She picked up a ceramic pitcher, wrinkled her nose, and said, "You know, you could do something more profitable with this space. It's got good bones." I just smiled and told her I liked it the way it was. She didn't know about the gallery, she didn't ask, and that was fine. Keeping it to myself felt right, like I was building something sacred that didn't need their fingerprints on it. Something that grew outside of the family shadow I'd lived under for so long. But not everything stayed small. Lyle called one afternoon and said a friend of his from the Oregon Historical Guild wanted to stop by. She'd heard about the Bellamy portrait and was curious what else I had tucked away. I almost said no, but something told me to let her in. Her name was Rachel. Gray curls, wide eyes, and a calm kind of energy that filled the room like a wool blanket in winter. She walked slowly through the gallery, stopping often, reading every note card, touching nothing. When she reached the final wall, a display of hand-sewn samplers by unnamed women from the late 1800s, she turned to me and said, "This matters, all of it." That night, she emailed me an invitation to speak at a regional gathering of preservationists. "Not as an expert," she said, "as someone who sees what most people miss." I didn't respond right away. I wasn't used to being asked. I wasn't used to my voice holding weight. But eventually, I said yes. Quiet Grove Ventures began to show up in unexpected places. Small mentions in preservation journals, a podcast interview here and there, even a local magazine cover story about the woman restoring lost voices through lost things. Still, I never felt like a success story. I felt like a custodian, a keeper of quiet legacies. People started sending things. Boxes arrived weekly from widows, retiring antique dealers, strangers who'd heard what I was doing and wanted to contribute. Some included notes. This belonged to my grandmother. No one in my family wanted it, but I couldn't bear to throw it away. I read every note. I kept them all. They became a kind of archive, too, a reminder that for every forgotten object there was once a hand that held it, a story that lived in it, a soul that shaped it. And maybe, just maybe, by honoring those things, I was learning how to honor myself. The gallery was beginning to hum with quiet life. I didn't advertise. Not in the traditional sense. No neon signs, no splashy social media campaigns. Just word of mouth, whispered conversations, and the occasional newspaper article someone found tucked inside their morning coffee run. But somehow, people came. Artists, teachers, grandmothers with soft voices and stories about the quilts their own mothers stitched by candlelight. A retired librarian drove in from 2 towns over just to donate a box of first edition children's books. When I asked why she chose me, she said, "Because you'd understand why they still matter." It felt like something was taking root. I applied for a small grant from the Oregon Arts Heritage Fund, almost on a whim. I wasn't sure if what I was doing counted as arts or heritage by their standards. But when the email came in weeks later with the subject line award notification, I read it 3 times before I could breathe properly. It wasn't a fortune, just $12,000. But to me, it was a message. Keep going. I used it to expand the upstairs space, added better lighting, archival shelves, temperature-controlled cases. I invited 2 local artists to display their work. I started hosting monthly storytelling nights. At first, I worried no one would come. But chairs filled slowly, then quickly. People stayed long after the stories ended, sipping tea, trading family memories like currency. It was community, in the purest sense. One Thursday afternoon, while cataloging a new batch of artifacts, I got a call from Olivia. I stared at the screen like it was a number I didn't recognize. I hadn't heard her voice in months. When I finally answered, she didn't say hello, just launched right in. "Do you know any good violin teachers? Abby's auditioning for a youth orchestra in Seattle and we need someone with real credentials." I blinked. "No hi?" A pause. "Oh, hi, sorry, things are just crazy around here." I didn't say anything, just waited. She continued. "Anyway, I thought maybe with your artsy connections you'd know someone." Artsy connections. That was how she still saw it. Not a gallery, not a business, not a fellowship program with real sponsors and national interest. Just a quirky little hobby. A side project run by the quiet sister who never quite grew up. I took a breath, then said, "I don't think I'm the right person to ask." Another pause. "Oh." That was it. She didn't ask how I was. Didn't ask about the shop. Didn't know I'd just received a letter from the Oregon Historical Society inviting me to speak on the preservation of female folk art in frontier communities. Didn't care, really. And somehow I didn't feel hurt this time. I just felt clear. The distance wasn't a wound anymore. It was a boundary. One I'd chosen. One I no longer needed to explain or justify. That weekend, I stood in the middle of the gallery as sunlight poured through the east windows. The walls were lined with work by women who'd never made it into history books. The scent of beeswax polish and chamomile tea drifted through the air. A young couple walked slowly through the space, holding hands, whispering to each other as they paused at each display. And I thought, this is what legacy feels like. Not applause, not permission, just the quiet knowing that something you made is standing on its own 2 feet, breathing in the world and holding space for others. That night, I wrote a new mission on the chalkboard by the front door. This space exists for every story that was ever interrupted. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like the forgotten daughter. I felt like the founder of something that mattered, even if they never saw it, especially if they didn't. Thanksgiving came around faster than I expected. I didn't plan to go, but I received a group text from my mom anyway. "Dinner starts at 4. Bring something if you can." No hi, Marianne. No would love to see you. Just a reminder. A schedule, a place setting without warmth. I almost deleted it without answering, but a part of me, probably the part still hanging on to the idea that family can change, typed back, "I'll bring dessert." I made a pear galette with brown butter crust. Simple, elegant, not too sweet. The kind of thing people eat without asking who made it. That felt like the safest bet. When I walked into the house, nothing had changed. Same over-decorated sideboard with fake fall leaves, same tension tucked beneath the polite laughter, same way Olivia's voice seemed to fill every corner of the room like she owned the oxygen. She hugged me stiffly. "You look tired. Business keeping you busy?" I nodded. "It's been a full season." She didn't ask what that meant. At dinner, Olivia talked about Abby's violin lessons and how expensive everything had become. She sighed dramatically and said, "Private instructors these days act like they're curing cancer." Everyone laughed. Except me. I sipped my wine and let my eyes wander. My mother was listening, clearly impressed by every update. My father, as usual, said little. He always looked like he was somewhere else during these gatherings. I used to wonder if he noticed me at all, or if his silence was just a way of agreeing with whoever was loudest. After the pie had been served and people began migrating toward the living room, Olivia sat next to me and whispered, "Honestly, I don't know how you do it. Living alone, fixing old furniture, doesn't it get boring?" I turned to her and smiled, soft and slow. "Not at all. Some things get more valuable the longer they're left alone." She blinked, like the sentence had gone over her head. I didn't explain it. The next day, I was back at the gallery, wiping down display cases and rearranging a collection of hand-carved bookends from the 1920s. A woman came in, someone I didn't recognize, holding a copy of the local magazine that had featured the shop the previous month. She held it up and said, "Are you Marianne?" "Yes." She smiled. "I drove 2 hours just to see this place. My sister passed recently and I've been looking for a way to feel close to her again. Something told me to come here." We stood together in the sunlight near the east window. She didn't say much else. Just walked the gallery slowly, hand on heart, eyes shining. After she left, I sat down with a journal I kept behind the register and wrote just one line. "This is where people go when they need to remember what love feels like." It struck me how little my family understood about who I'd become. They still saw the girl who collected broken clocks and pressed flowers into dictionaries, the one who spent prom night reorganizing old books in the attic. To them, I'd always be the one who didn't quite fit. But here, in this quiet space I built, I wasn't strange, I wasn't overlooked, I was necessary. People came not just for antiques but for restoration, in every sense of the word, to remember, to reconnect, to grieve, to begin again. That was what Olivia would never understand. Her world ran on resumes and recognizable success. Mine ran on reverence, on memory, on grace. And even if she never saw it, I had stopped needing her to. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop waiting to be seen by people who refuse to look, and instead build something so rooted, so whole, it doesn't matter who's watching. Because in the end, the work speaks for itself. And so do you? December crept in with its usual quiet. Roseberry didn't do big holidays. Just simple wreaths on front doors, warm lights in bakery windows, and the occasional wind chime ringing somewhere down an empty street. At Quiet Grove, we hosted our first winter curation night, a slow evening filled with mulled cider, poetry, and candlelight tours through the gallery. People lingered longer than usual. One woman cried while reading the label beside an embroidered sampler that read, "Come what may, I'll stay me." A retired woodworker from Eugene left a carved angel on my front desk with no note, just a gentle nod before he stepped back into the snow. I thought about not attending the family's Christmas Eve dinner. But guilt is a tricky thing. Not the kind that comes from doing something wrong, the kind you inherit. The kind that's passed down like the chipped gravy boat no one wants but no one throws away. So I went. I wore a deep green wool coat and brought a tin of peppermint shortbread wrapped in parchment and twine. The kind of gift you give when you expect it to be forgotten on the counter. Inside, everything was as expected. Olivia's voice rose above the soft piano music in the background. She was dressed in something glittery, laughing too loudly, gesturing with a wineglass like she was presenting a quarterly report to shareholders. Her husband, Grant, stood nearby, checking his phone. Abby sat curled up on the couch scrolling TikTok, earbuds in. My mother bustled in the kitchen, muttering about not having enough truffle oil for the risotto. I slipped into a quiet chair by the fireplace, sipped cider, and watched it all like someone passing through a museum, familiar artifacts behind glass, frozen in time. At dinner, the conversation circled the usual cul-de-sacs, Abby's summer music program, Grant's new promotion, Olivia's Pilates certification. Then, out of nowhere, Olivia turned to me and said, "So, you still doing that? What is it, artisan resale?" I smiled. "The gallery's doing well." She nodded, as if humoring a child's science fair project. "That's nice. Honestly, I admire you. I could never survive without a steady paycheck." My mother chuckled, not maliciously, just carelessly. "Well, she's always been the artistic one. Practicality was never really Marianne's thing." I could feel my fork pause mid-air. They weren't trying to be cruel. That's the thing. It would have been easier if they were. They just didn't see me. Still, not after everything. Not after the exhibitions, the preservation work, the grant funding, the growing community that was starting to depend on what I built. To them, I was still the girl with dusty books and a crooked ponytail. After dessert, Olivia cornered me in the hallway. "You know," she said, swirling her wine, "Abby's college list is ambitious. Juilliard, Eastman. We're tightening things financially, so if you ever wanted to contribute to her music fund, I know it would mean a lot." It took me a second to respond. Not because I was surprised by the ask, but because of the way she framed it, as if I owed them something, as if all those years of being overlooked had been background music while she lived the main melody. I looked her dead in the eye. "Olivia, you've never once asked me how I'm doing." "Not really, and I've never asked you for anything. So no, I won't be contributing." Her smile faltered just for a second before reassembling itself. "Well, I didn't mean to offend, I just thought, family helps family." "Does it?" I said quietly. I turned away before she could answer. That night, as I drove home through the empty streets, I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I just felt finished. The kind of finish that doesn't need to slam a door. Just the kind that stops knocking. In the weeks after Christmas, something settled inside me. Not anger, not resentment, clarity. I woke up every morning before sunrise, brewed strong coffee in the French press I found at a flea market, and opened the doors to Quiet Grove before the light even touched the windows. The cold air made my breath visible, but I didn't mind. I wrapped myself in layers, turned on the low lamps, and began the quiet work of placing history where it belonged. The back room of the gallery had once been a dusty storage area. I spent January transforming it into a restoration lab. I ordered archival materials, built custom shelving, and laid down wool rugs that muffled the sound of footsteps. It became a sanctuary within a sanctuary, a place where damaged objects were given a second breath. People began bringing me their heirlooms. A woman from Medford brought in a box of broken porcelain birds that had once lined her grandmother's window. An elderly man delivered a set of Civil War letters, folded so thin the creases had nearly erased the ink. One young man brought in a quilt, torn and faded, that had belonged to the great aunt who raised him after his mother left. He placed it on the table and said softly, "This is all I have left of her." I didn't need to say much. I just got to work. As I stitched, dusted, and glued, I started thinking less about who had rejected me and more about what I was building for the people who chose to show up. There was power in that shift, a different kind of power than I'd grown up around. In my family, power came from titles, from income brackets and resumes, from who you married, what school your child got into, which wine you brought to dinner. But in my world, power was quiet. It looked like a woman standing in a cold gallery restoring a family Bible by hand. It sounded like the breath someone let out when they saw their grandmother's locket cleaned and shining for the first time in 40 years. It felt like purpose. On a rainy Thursday afternoon in February, I got a letter. Not an email, a letter. Cream-colored paper, hand-addressed, with a seal from the Western Museum Conservators Circle. They'd heard about Quiet Grove through the Oregon Historical Society and wanted to invite me to apply for their Preservation Partnership program. It came with funding, resources, national recognition. I sat at the work table with the letter in my hands, blinking back something I couldn't quite name. It wasn't pride. It was something older than that, belonging. That weekend, I hosted our first ever traveling exhibit, pieces on loan from small-town museums across Oregon. Each item came with a story written by someone whose family had lived through it. I displayed the notes alongside the objects, giving voice to the unseen. The gallery was full for 2 nights straight. On the second night, a woman approached me as I was refilling the cider. "I brought my daughter," she said. "She's been struggling lately, and I wanted her to see something that shows quiet things still matter." I thanked her, and after she left, I stood for a long time looking at the room filled with strangers, each touched in their own way by what I had made. And I thought, this is what I was born to do. Not impress my mother, not compete with Olivia, not prove anything, just offer something honest. And let it speak. That night I locked the doors and stood in the center of the room. Outside, the rain had stopped. The town was quiet. The only sound was the creak of the old wood floors beneath my boots. I exhaled. The space I had built, the life I had chosen, it was no longer just mine. It had become something that belonged to others too. It had become a place, and not just a gallery, a refuge, a quiet grove in the middle of a loud world. Easter Sunday arrived with blooming daffodils and tension I could feel before even stepping through the front door. Mom had texted me earlier in the week, asking, more like assigning me to bring dessert. Something light, she wrote, not too strange. I read the message twice before deciding on lemon ricotta tarts dusted with powdered sugar. When I walked into my parents' house, the air was thick with roast ham and the kind of politeness that hurts more than silence. The table was dressed in pastel colors, all coordinated, all a little too perfect. Olivia was already there, in a fitted dress the color of champagne, sipping something fizzy and making sure everyone knew how hard it had been to organize Abby's upcoming auditions. She barely glanced up when I entered. Mom took the desserts from my hands and offered a quick, "Oh, thanks," before rushing back to the kitchen. Dad sat in his usual chair, flipping through the newspaper, even though no one read those anymore. He looked up at me briefly, then back down. I should have known. I should have trusted the weight in my chest. We sat for dinner, passing around bowls and conversation like nothing had changed. But something had. I could feel it. Halfway through the meal, I got up to help clear the dishes. I left my phone on the kitchen counter. That's when it happened. Olivia must have seen the screen light up. Maybe curiosity got the better of her. Maybe envy had been waiting for a crack. Either way, when I came back from the sink, the room was quiet. Too quiet. My phone was in her hand. She was staring at an email that had just come in, a quarterly update from my investment portfolio. The subject line was simple. Quiet Grove Holdings Q1 report, $16.3 million total asset value. She looked up slowly, her voice thin and sharp. "What is this?" Mom turned, eyes narrowing. Dad set his paper down. I could feel the blood drain from my face, but I didn't flinch. Olivia held the phone out toward me like it was a smoking gun. "You've been hiding money, you have $16 million, and you're letting us scrape by?" I didn't answer, because I knew nothing I said would be heard anyway. Mom stepped in, arms folded. "Why would you keep something like this from your family? Do you have any idea how selfish this looks?" That word, selfish. It landed like a slap. Olivia joined in, her voice rising. "Abby's tuition is outrageous. You knew that. You could have helped, and you chose not to." I stood still, as if rooted to the floorboards, and for the first time I spoke the truth out loud. When I was struggling, none of you asked what I needed. When I was building something quietly, you mocked it. And now that it's become something real, suddenly I owe you something? Mom opened her mouth to argue, but I held up my hand. "I spent years trying to earn your approval, trying to be enough, and you didn't see me. You saw someone inconvenient, someone who made you uncomfortable." My voice didn't shake. "I'm not angry. I'm just done." I picked up my phone, walked past their stunned faces, and left, not in a storm, not in a fury, just with a calmness I'd never felt before, the kind that comes when you finally stop asking to be loved the way someone isn't willing to love you. And as I drove away, I realized something even more powerful. I wasn't walking away from them. I was walking toward myself. I didn't go home right away. Instead, I drove to the gallery. It was after 9, the streets empty, the sky thick with stars I hadn't noticed in a while. I unlocked the front door, stepped inside, and just stood there. The soft hum of the fridge in the break room, the faint scent of beeswax and cedar, the old wooden floor under my feet. It felt safe. Mine. I sat down near the east window, the one that caught the morning light just right, and looked at my phone. Messages were already coming in. From Olivia. "We need to talk. You overreacted." From Mom. "Family sticks together. Call me when you're ready to apologize." From Dad. "Nothing. Just a missed call." I didn't respond. Not because I was being spiteful, but because I finally understood something I'd never allowed myself to believe. They weren't going to change. They weren't going to wake up one day and see me for who I was. They had decided long ago who I was supposed to be, and anything outside that box made them uncomfortable. That night, I wrote a letter. Not to them. To myself. I wrote down everything I'd never said. Every time I'd bitten my tongue. Every moment I'd accepted less than I deserved, just to keep the peace. By the time I finished, the sun was rising, and I felt like I'd set something down I didn't need to carry anymore. The following week, Olivia showed up at second verse. She didn't knock. Just walked in with that same breezy confidence she'd always worn like a coat. "I figured we should clear the air," she said, glancing around the store like she'd forgotten how much it had changed. I didn't offer her tea. I didn't ask her to sit. She launched into a speech about misunderstandings and family obligations, about how maybe she'd been harsh, but that I'd blindsided them. She even used the word betrayal. That was the moment I realized this wasn't an apology. It was a warning. If I didn't step back into the role they assigned me, the quiet, reliable one, the background character in their version of family, I'd be labeled the villain. I let her finish. Then I looked her in the eye and said, I don't owe you an explanation, and I'm not asking for approval. I'm just asking for space. She blinked, caught off guard. Space? She repeated like it was a foreign word. Yes, boundaries. I'm allowed to have them. She laughed, nervous now. You think you're better than us, don't you? No, I said calmly. I think I'm finally becoming myself. And that makes you uncomfortable. She left in a huff. I didn't watch her go. I turned back to the desk, opened my notebook, and began writing plans for the Quiet Grove Fellowship launch. A grant program I'd been developing for young artisans without access to traditional training. The kind of initiative that could change someone's life in the same way restoring forgotten things had changed mine. I no longer needed to prove anything to anyone, not to the woman who once told me art was a waste of time, not to the father who remained silent even when silence hurt the most, not to the sister who believed love was transactional. I had nothing to prove, only something to protect. Myself, my peace, and the quiet life I'd built out of every cracked thing they once called worthless. In the days that followed Olivia's visit, the silence from my family grew louder than any argument ever could. No more texts, no phone calls. Even the passive-aggressive forwarded emails from Mom stopped showing up in my inbox. I expected to feel relief, and I did. But it came tangled with something else. A strange sort of mourning. Not for the people themselves, but for the version of me that had spent so many years trying to fit into their mold. That version was gone now. And even though she was always bending, always apologizing, I still had to grieve her. I let myself feel it. Late at night, I'd walk through the gallery alone, touching the edges of displays, listening to the quiet hum of the building like it was breathing with me. Sometimes I'd pause in front of a quilt or a painting and wonder about the artist's life, what they gave up, what they held on to. It made me think, maybe family isn't where you come from. Maybe it's what you protect when no one else understands why it matters. One morning, I opened a letter from a girl named Ellie. She was 19, from a small farming town in eastern Oregon. She'd seen a piece about Quiet Grove on public radio and wrote to ask if I ever took on apprentices. She said she was good with her hands and had always loved restoring things, especially things people thought weren't worth fixing. I read her words over and over. Something about them stuck with me. I invited her for an interview the following week. She showed up in secondhand boots and a denim jacket, hair in a messy braid. She was nervous but eager, her hands calloused from work that most people never notice. I asked her why she wanted to be here. She said, "Because I want to build something that lasts, and because when I heard your story, I realized I wasn't the only one who felt invisible." That was it. I hired her on the spot. Ellie became the first official Quiet Grove Fellow. She brought a spark to the space I didn't know it needed. Together, we rearranged the exhibit flow, designed new educational workshops, and started documenting oral histories from local craftspeople. I watched her grow into herself the way I had, slowly but surely. And I realized I didn't need my family to witness my success. It was enough to live it. One evening in late spring, I received an invitation in the mail. It was from Olivia. A formal printed card inviting me to Abby's recital. No handwritten note, just the date, time, and address of some performance hall in Portland. I stared at it for a long time, not out of indecision, but out of clarity. This wasn't a real invitation. It was a performance, another test to see if I would return to the role they preferred, the supportive sister, the one who showed up, stayed quiet, and disappeared before things got complicated. I didn't RSVP. Instead, I spent that evening at the gallery with Ellie and a small group of local artists. We were prepping a new exhibit, folk instruments from early immigrant communities, each one with a story of resilience, loss, and quiet defiance. We laughed a lot that night. We worked late into the evening, hands covered in dust and varnish, hearts full. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. Not looking in from the outside, but rooted, seen. And finally, Free. 2 weeks after the recital invitation, I received a voicemail from my mother. Her tone was sharp, but controlled, the kind of voice she used when trying to sound composed for the neighbors. "Marianne, I'm not sure what you're trying to prove by isolating yourself. Your sister included you because she's trying to extend an olive branch. You might consider showing some grace. We're your family, whether you like it or not." I listened to the message 3 times, not because I was uncertain about what to do, but because I finally heard it clearly. The problem had never been that they didn't understand me. It was that they never tried to. That Sunday, I invited them all to dinner at the gallery. No context, no explanation, just an invitation, with a time and an address. I set the table upstairs in the loft space, a warm room filled with handmade furniture, soft light, and paintings curated by women who'd never had the chance to exhibit their work during their lifetimes. There were no candles, no attempt to impress, just presence. They arrived together. Olivia in heels too high for the gallery's old wood floors. Mom clutching her purse like a shield. Dad walking 2 steps behind, as always. I welcomed them politely, led them upstairs, and poured tea into mismatched porcelain cups from a thrift store in Coos Bay. They looked around, visibly confused by the calm. No chaos, no confrontation, just stillness. We ate in near silence. Halfway through dessert, Olivia finally asked, "So what's all this about?" I set my fork down gently. "I thought it was time to stop pretending." Mom narrowed her eyes. "Pretending what?" "That we're close, that we understand each other, that I owe you some version of myself that fits into your definition of what matters." Olivia scoffed. "You invited us just to say that?" "No," I replied. "I invited you because I've spent most of my life waiting for this moment." They didn't respond, so I kept going. "I used to think if I worked hard enough, stayed quiet enough, was useful enough, you'd finally see me. That maybe then I'd earn a place at this table that didn't come with strings or conditions." My voice didn't waver. "But what I've learned is, there's peace in walking away from a seat that was never mine to begin with." Mom blinked fast, caught between indignation and disbelief. Dad finally spoke. "You've done well. We didn't know." I nodded. "That's because you didn't ask." A long pause followed, one of those silences where everything true floats to the surface whether you name it or not. "I don't need you to be proud of me," I said. "I'm proud of me, and I won't shrink just to make this dynamic more comfortable." I stood. "You're welcome to be part of my life, but only if you meet me as I am, not as the version of me you've constructed in your heads." No one said a word as they stood to leave. No dramatic exit, no hugs, just the quiet shuffle of coats being pulled from hooks. As they stepped into the evening air, I didn't feel empty. I felt full. Because I had finally spoken my truth, not for them, but for me. And that was enough. Spring melted into early summer, and with it came something I hadn't felt in a long time. Space. Not just physical space, although the gallery had expanded into the adjoining brick storefront, but space inside me. The kind that's only possible when you stop explaining yourself to people who were never listening. The fellowship applications came pouring in, from young artists, craftspeople, preservationists, people who reminded me of who I'd once been, curious, unseen, and desperate for someone to believe in the value of what they loved. We accepted 4 fellows that year. Ellie, of course, stayed on as program coordinator. She'd grown into her role like a tree finding light, her quiet confidence shaping the tone of the place more than she realized. Then there was Daniel, a luthier from a small town in Idaho who could make a violin sing from a splinter of scrap wood. Maria, a Navajo weaver in her early 30s, who had been preserving traditional loom techniques in her grandmother's garage. Jules, a trans woodcarver from Mississippi, whose intricate storyboxes told entire lifetimes through delicate inlays. They didn't just bring talent, they brought their whole selves. And I gave them space to be seen. We worked side by side, sanding, mending, researching, laughing. We hosted open studio nights once a month, and the community started showing up in numbers I'd never imagined. Families, teachers, local historians, even tourists from out of state who'd heard whispers about the place where broken things come back to life. But the moment that stays with me the most happened on a quiet Wednesday. An elderly woman walked in just before closing, clutching a wooden clock wrapped in an old towel. She said, "This was my mother's. It hasn't ticked in over 50 years. I I can't throw it away. I looked at the clock. It was simple, worn, a little cracked, but it had weight, memory, love. She left it with us. And a few weeks later, when I called to say it was working again, she cried on the phone. She picked it up in person the next day, held it close like a heartbeat returned. Before leaving, she looked around the gallery, then back at me and said, "Places like this don't just restore objects, they restore people too." Her words landed deeper than I expected, because that's what Quiet Grove had become. Not a business, not even a project, a home. Not just for me, but for anyone who had been told their value was conditional, circumstantial, or invisible. I'd spent so long thinking revenge meant proving them wrong. But maybe the truest revenge is never about them at all. Maybe it's choosing to build a life so full, so rooted in your own values, that their absence doesn't leave a void, only room for something better, something real. The Quiet Grove Fellowship turned into something larger than I ever imagined. By midsummer, we were hosting weekend classes for local kids, partnering with high schools to preserve folk art techniques that had nearly vanished. On Saturdays, we held storytelling circles in the back garden where elders passed down memories that had never been written down. The gallery buzzed with life and purpose, not as a trend, but as a sanctuary. One morning I found a letter tucked into the front door, no return address, just my name, written in soft cursive across the envelope. Inside was a short note. "I walked past your window last night and saw the light still on. You looked peaceful. I sat with that letter for a long time. Whoever wrote it didn't need recognition. They just wanted to bear witness. And in a way, that was more powerful than applause. We weren't just restoring broken objects anymore. We were restoring forgotten worth. People came in with more than heirlooms. They brought stories, shame, silence, and piece by piece we helped them find shape again." One afternoon, Ellie and I were sorting through an old box of donations, buttons, patches, scraps of handwritten recipes, when she looked up at me and said, "You know, I never thought I'd feel safe in a place like this, but this space, it doesn't ask me to be anyone but myself." It hit me in the chest, because that's all I'd ever wanted for myself. And now I was offering it to others. We hosted an exhibit in August titled "The Hands That Carried Us." It was a collection of worn tools, faded fabrics, letters written in calloused handwriting. Every item told the story of labor, migration, sacrifice, and love without fanfare. The opening night was standing room only. I didn't dress up. I wore a navy cotton dress I found at a thrift store and pinned my grandmother's brooch to the collar. People walked through the gallery with reverence, some crying softly, others quietly placing their hands over their hearts. Near the end of the evening, a woman approached me. Middle-aged, tired eyes, strong posture. She said she'd grown up in Roseberry, left for 30 years, and had just come back. She told me, "I've never seen this town honor people like my parents before, until now." That night, as I closed up, I looked around and realized I no longer needed to explain my work to anyone. Not to justify it, not to defend it. It spoke for itself. Quiet Grove wasn't born out of ambition. It was born out of being unseen, out of choosing to plant roots anyway, and now those roots were bearing fruit, not just in dollars or headlines, but in dignity, in belonging, in proof that value doesn't have to shout to be real. Sometimes it just has to be allowed. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was holding my breath. I felt settled, in my space, in my skin, in my story. The first signs of autumn began to settle over Roseberry. Leaves turned the color of rust and honey, and the air in the mornings carried that crispness that always reminded me of childhood walks to school, clutching my lunchbox and pretending I didn't hear the kids whisper behind me. But this year, fall didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a quiet beginning. Quiet Grove had been running steadily for almost a full year now. We had hosted over a dozen workshops, funded fellowships for 6 emerging artisans, and started a community archive of oral histories that local schools were beginning to use in their lesson plans. But numbers weren't what kept me going. It was the people. Like Mr. Alvarez, who brought in a broken accordion and ended up staying for 3 hours, telling stories about his first dance with his late wife. Or the 2 teenage sisters who signed up for our quilting class and said it was the first time they'd ever made something with their hands instead of a screen. Each face, each object, each conversation, it all added layers to the kind of legacy I never thought I'd have. Then, one afternoon in early October, something unexpected happened. A letter. From my father. Handwritten, carefully folded. No return address, just my name. I opened it slowly, unsure of what I wanted it to say. Inside, his handwriting was neat, almost stiff, like someone afraid to make a mistake. He wrote, "Marianne, I walked by the gallery last week. I didn't come in, I just stood across the street and watched for a while. I saw you helping a young man lift something heavy. You smiled. Not the kind of smile you used to wear at family dinners. This one was real. I realized something that day. I never really saw you, not the way a father should. I let your mother's voice be louder than your worth, and for that I'm sorry. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know, I see it now. What you've built, who you are, and it's beautiful." I read the letter 3 times, then folded it back slowly, like it was something fragile. I didn't cry, I didn't call him, but I placed the letter in the drawer of my workbench beneath the sketches for our next exhibit. Not as a trophy, not as a promise, but as a reminder that sometimes the smallest acknowledgments come when we least expect them. And that healing doesn't always come from the people who hurt us. Sometimes it comes from the life we build in spite of it. Later that night, as I swept the gallery floors and dimmed the lights, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror near the entrance. Hair tied back, cheeks a little flushed, hands slightly stained with varnish. And I thought, this is who I've become. Not because of applause, not because of acceptance, but because I stopped waiting to be chosen and chose myself instead. That's the kind of quiet that doesn't need noise to feel powerful. It just needs room to breathe. Thanksgiving came quietly that year. No big plans, no invitations sent out, just a sense that something was shifting, like the final page of a book turning itself. I decided to host a small dinner in the loft above the gallery. Nothing elaborate, just warm lighting, a handmade table runner Ellie and I stitched together, and a menu that reminded me of my grandmother's kitchen: roasted squash, sourdough stuffing, apple pie with too much cinnamon. The night before, I stood by the window, watching the streetlights blink across Roseberry's quiet downtown. Everything felt still, but not empty. Full in a way I hadn't known fullness before. And then came the surprise. My parents showed up. Not together, but they came. First, Dad, carrying a store-bought pie and a bouquet of slightly wilted flowers. He didn't say much, just handed them to me and asked if he could help set the table. Then 15 minutes later, Mom. She hesitated at the door, looked older than I remembered, or maybe just smaller, like she had finally stopped holding herself so tightly. "I wasn't sure you'd open the door," she said. "I wasn't sure you'd knock," I replied. We didn't hug, but we didn't need to. They both sat quietly through dinner. No grand speeches, no apologies, just presence, and for once, that was enough. The conversation drifted to safe topics: weather, the gallery, Dad's bad back, and Mom's new love for crossword puzzles. But under it all, something softer had settled. Not reconciliation, not repair, something simpler: recognition. They were beginning to see the life I had built not as rebellion, but as something real, something steady. After dessert, I offered them a tour of the space, showed them the quilts, the archives, the community corner where kids now painted after school. Dad stopped at a photo on the wall, me, Ellie, and our fellows from the first cohort. He stared at it for a long time. "You look happy?" he said. I nodded. "I am." It wasn't an ending, it wasn't a full circle, but it was honest, and after a lifetime of pretending, that was more than enough. A few weeks after Thanksgiving, I started waking up before the alarm again. Not from stress, but from stillness. The kind of stillness that happens when the noise in your head finally quiets. No mental rehearsals, no internal negotiations about who you need to be that day, just breath, and light, and time. Most mornings, I'd make tea and sit by the upstairs window where the sunlight came in slant and golden. From there, I could see the whole street, the bakery, the post office, the church with the crooked bell tower. Familiar, unchanged. But I had changed. Not in loud, dramatic ways, but in the quiet, necessary kind. I was no longer waiting for someone to name my worth, no longer explaining my choices in hopes that someone might approve. I had stopped chasing what I thought was love and started listening to what felt like truth. Some afternoons, I'd find myself in the back corner of the gallery, running my fingers over old textiles or forgotten letters, and I'd think, this is it. This is where I belong. Not in a spotlight, not on a pedestal, just in a place where care lives. And that became enough. One Sunday, Ellie brought her younger brother to visit. He was 13, awkward and wide-eyed, still figuring out where he fit in the world. He wandered into the archive room and stood in front of an old photo of a woman holding a broken banjo. He turned to me and asked, "Why keep all this old stuff?" I smiled. Because what's old still matters. Just like people, just like memories. Nothing is too small to hold meaning. He nodded like he understood. And maybe he did, because sometimes the smallest hearts carry the deepest knowing. That night, after locking up, I sat by the same window and watched snow begin to fall for the first time that winter, the kind of snow that blankets everything in quiet. I thought about how far I'd come. Not in miles, but in courage. I wasn't the same woman who once begged to be invited to her sister's reception, who stood on porches hoping to be let in. I had built my own porch, opened my own door, and if others came in peace, they were welcome. But if not, I no longer chased them down the road. I just returned to the quiet, to the work, to myself. It was a late afternoon in December when I found myself standing by the tall window above the gallery. The sun was dipping low, casting a soft amber glow across the wooden floor. Dust floated gently in the light. The world outside moved slowly. Cars passed, someone laughed across the street, a dog barked once and fell quiet again. I picked up an old wooden frame from the table nearby. Inside was a faded sketch of a mountain range signed only with the initials L. No one knew who the artist was. No one ever came to claim it. But to me it was perfect. I straightened it gently and set it on the shelf. Then I stood there for a while, just breathing. No rush, no noise, just stillness. And it was in that stillness that the truth felt clearest. You don't need to be seen by everyone to be whole. You just need to stop disappearing from yourself. I spent years trying to earn my place, trying to prove that I mattered. But the moment I stopped seeking approval was the moment I became free, not free from pain or memory or even the ache of what could have been, but free to stand where I am, firm, quiet, enough. And now, if you're listening, really listening, I hope you'll take this with you. You are not too quiet to be powerful. You are not too different to be worthy. You don't have to be chosen to choose yourself. Because healing doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it looks like leaving the table where you were never truly welcomed. Sometimes it means building your own and letting others come if they can meet you with love. So if this story touched something in you, don't let it stay a thought. Share it. Talk about it. Let someone else know they're not alone. And if you've ever felt like the stranger in your own life, maybe it's time to come home. To you. Thank you for watching The Quiet Becoming. If this story stayed with you, like and subscribe.